Loading. Welcome to Access the Animus.
Hello everyone and welcome to a new video here on Access the Animus. In the new episode of our analysis of the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, we're going to have a look at the lead up to the ending of the DLC with a focus on Surtr's plan and a proper explanation about what he was trying to obtain with Baldr and the Salakar Artifact before finally moving on to discuss the tower that was at the center of it all, its direct ties to Assassin's Creed 3 and the original 6 methods of salvation, and the first pieces of information about Juno's situation during the events shown in the DLC. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking it, subscribing to our channel and turning the notifications on so you won't miss any of our future updates. And with that out of the way, let's dive into Surtr's plan and all the information about Juno's tower. As you might have seen, this is not the final episode of the analysis because in my original script it would have been too long of a video, so I pulled the Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows here and divided the final episode in two. Soon you'll get why there's a Harry Potter reference right there. So we pick up where we left off, with Odin finding out about Baldr's death and taking his revenge on Sinmara before all his rage and fear have an actual shock effect on Eivor, who wakes up and after some more trials with Valka is able to go back in Odin's memories, and apparently there has been a time skip. Odin is talking about quote-unquote some eternities where he's been away from Svartalfheim, possibly to mourn his son and wife, while Evildeed talks about merely days. But anyway, after this unquantifiable time, he gets back to Svartalfheim to finish the job and get his revenge on Surtr. And plot twist, apparently in a territory that is still under invasion, he has left the Salakar to Evildeed and Brokkr, not only putting their life at risk, but also making it so easy for Surtr to get it. In general, to me, this time skip with Odin being away from Svartalfheim for no tangible gameplay or story reason seems another hint towards some issues during the development cycle of the DLC. It feels like some kind of scene was meant to take place between Odin's acceptance of Baldr's death, him giving the Salakar to the dwarves and then leaving the territory, which is not shown either, and him coming back, but alas, maybe that's just my own feeling. Anyway, when Odin gets to the shelter, he finds it occupied by some North African Isu guards, again not a great idea to leave the Salakar there, so he takes care of them and finds out that Brokkr has gone to Eitri with the Salakar to get more answers, because apparently, once again, they still don't know what the Salakar is about. Thus he travels to Eitri and finds Brokkr, who has changed a bit and is a little more erratic, but apparently seems to have finally understood how to use the artifact and its purpose, and when Odin asks him to tell him, he says he doesn't have a clue. I don't really know what to say anymore. So through their dialogue, it seems like the Salakar's purpose isn't to kill Surtr, but it can nonetheless, apparently, because the artifact harnesses quote-unquote a lot of light, which Odin confirms to have been Baldr's gift. And this light that Baldr was carrying inside of him is what Surtr needs to make the Salakar work, while the other consciences have been put in the Salakar just to balance that of Baldr. Again, pretty vague, but in our last video of this series we learned that the Isu essences power the Salakar artifacts, and that different Salakars have different purposes based on the different energy that they contain, and thus based on the different consciences that they contain. So following on that, we can imagine that beyond the mythological veil, Brokkr here is saying that Surtr needed exactly Baldr's conscience inside the Salakar in order for the Salakar to do something specific for him, while all the other Isu essences placed in the Salakar were there just to balance the energy that Baldr's conscience would have produced. So what was the final purpose of Surtr's plan? What did he want to achieve with the Salakar and that specific energy inside of it? Well, like I said in the last video, the main story of the DLC does not explain that, but stick around because something outside of the main story does reveal that, and we are going to discuss it later in the video. Back to Brokkr, apparently what he just said wasn't the whole thing, because the DLC here uses the Horcrux card and states that a little bit of Surtr's essence is in the Salakar. Why is it there, or how did it get there? Again, not really explained, neither in the main story nor outside of it. We can imagine that he either placed it there to balance Baldr's energy even more, or that he needed to place it in the Salakar in order to never really be killed, kinda like Voldemort in the Harry Potter series. But he was already an unkillable Isu before he put his hands on the Salakar, so that wouldn't make too much sense. So Baldr just states that if Surtr touches the Salakar and thus his essence is finally revealed, then he will become the Salakar and he will become unstoppable. And I don't have a clear idea about what is happening here anymore. I guess this is super vaguely saying that by reuniting his essence, Surtr would become a Salakar, as in a vessel of souls, but again there's no explanation as to how any of that would work. Plus, why would he put a bit of his essence there if he can become unstoppable only by reuniting with it? Couldn't he be unstoppable in the first place without the Horcrux thing? The DLC does say though that having Surtr touch the Salakar would bring him together, yes, but he wouldn't be able to sustain all the energy contained in the Salakar and generated by Baldr's essence because he's too old and his body isn't made to contain all that energy. So why would he even seek to be reunited with it? I literally have no idea about all of this, how vague it is, and more importantly, I don't know how that could be translated in the Isu era, if any of that really happened. Maybe you guys can help me with this, and maybe I did miss some information here and there, but in my opinion, this mythology thing, and I'm sad to say this, but the way it is presented here, this mythology thing has to stop. It doesn't make sense visually, and it doesn't make sense narrative-wise, or it's too hermetic to be understood. It just has to be stopped, or at the very least reworked to make sense within AC and the established story, otherwise it's pretty useless for most fans. Plus, I wasn't a big fan of how this part of the story was conveyed too. This is just an information drop at the end, while throughout the entire DLC, Odin and the player don't get any of this information as to how to kill Surtr. It's just delivered massively at the end, with no learning whatsoever. It's just some story exposition that vaguely tells the character and the player that they have to use the artifact after defeating the main villain, which wasn't an amazing look. Anyway, it is time. Let's get to Surtr's plan. Eventually, Odin reaches Surtr in his hideout that we saw at the start of the DLC, and so they fight with some mockery by the giant, who even says, "I am Surtr, destroyer of worlds," which is a reference to his character in the Norse mythology, but also to his plans, as we'll see. So Odin defeats Surtr temporarily, because remember, he stole the technology that allowed the ancient Isu to renew themselves, and that's where Odin decides to use the Salakar on him to trigger the Voldemort Horcrux moment and kill him, and while this emits an energy blast that destroys the entire building, apparently Surtr isn't dead and Baldr's plan hasn't worked. Baldr somehow, again I don't have any idea why, but there he realizes that the Salakar is a key, and supposedly it is a key to do something with the tower, and Surtr confirms that the Salakar is actually half the key, and that he or his essence is the other half of the same key, and at this point I think we should finally talk about Surtr's plan. Like I said, and again correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below, you can't find any information in the main story that would logically allow you to understand Surtr's plan, which is pretty much the entire motivation for the invasion of Svartalfheim and a huge justification for the DLC's existence as a whole. But you can find it in a random document placed in a random house located in the outer area of the city of Atri that we were able to find only thanks to a heads up by our superfan crafting ranger. This is a document written by none other than Juno, and we're going to delve into all of its details later when we're going to discuss the tower, but suffice to say that in this document Juno realizes that Surtr is trying to use the tower, and actually supposedly other towers too, in order to turn them into weapons against the rest of the world, and thus against other Isu groups or territories, here called as 9 realms. I know, taking over the world is not the most original and powerful premise ever, especially considering this major explanation is hidden in the middle of nowhere and isn't even mentioned in the entire story, save from one line where Surtr says he wants to be the master of all 9 realms. Actually, let me know in the comments below how many of you knew about this document and about Surtr's actual motivations. I think that would make for a very interesting statistic. Nonetheless, Surtr is described as an Isu warlord, so I guess this plan matches his character. So I would imagine that while invading the ancient Isu, he also got to know that the Salakar artifacts could create some huge amounts of energy if powered by the proper essences, and he decided to use this tower, which, as we'll see, is a discarded remnant of the first method of salvation engineered by Juno and introduced in Assassin's Creed 3. He decided to use this tower as some kind of amplifier that would have worked as a weapon of mass destruction that he could have aimed towards the various territories on Earth. And considering that the mix of the Salakar, Surtr's essence, and the tower actually led to the Toba catastrophe, which hit the entirety of the planet Earth, you can see where this is going. But why is the tower so important here? That also comes from this document hidden in the middle of nowhere. The tower is so important because it's not a random one. By reading the document, we get to know that it is written by Juno because she is saying that she's being chased by Sinmara's Chosen, which in turn, as we saw in our previous video, had been suggested by Baldr to indeed go after Juno. So she is the author of this journal that begins mid-sentence by saying, "As the creator of this failed solution, I'm intrigued to understand how Surtr intends to bend it to his advantage." Here Juno, who has reached the territory known as Svartalfheim after fleeing the Greco-Roman Isu region because of the theft of the Seven Method along with Odin, here she finds out that the tower, who she is calling her failed solution, is being reworked by Surtr, which echoes Asa saying that Surtr was rebuilding something powerful for his plans. The notion that this tower is a failed solution created by Juno is the key here, because it's a direct reference to the first of the 6 failed methods of salvation that Juno, Jupiter, and Minerva engineered to save the first civilization and that were described in Assassin's Creed 3. In that game, Juno actually described the original idea for the first method as a set of 4 towers aimed at absorbing the solar flare and contain it in order to avert the Toba catastrophe that the Isu had predicted in their own calculations. More specifically, the towers were planned to absorb all the energy, the sun's fury as Juno called it, and convey it to the Grand Temple in Turin in order to dispel it. But even with all the knowledge that the Isu had during Juno's time, the towers would have required more than 1,000 years to be built. So construction started on the first tower, and now we know that it was built in the area here called as Svartalfheim, but it was never completed, and thus Juno, Jupiter, and Minerva moved on, but quote-unquote some came back to automate the construction process of the towers, potentially through the use of some machines or robots, because Juno stated that metal might finish what flesh could not. Back in AC3, that was a reference to the fact that while the Isu did not have time to finish even the first tower during the Isu era, after Juno was able to transfer her conscience in the Grand Temple machinery and the Toba catastrophe took place, she had more than 75,000 years to plan her comeback. That was more than enough time to finally finish the 4 towers through this automated process, and once the towers were completed and operational, she had her bargaining chip that she could propose to Desmond. Saved the world from the second disaster in 2012 by touching the global Aurora Borealis device and remotely activating the 4 towers connected to it, which by then had ended up underground according to narrative director Darby McDevitt, in exchange for being liberated from the Grand Temple machinery. And maybe it's just my imagination that is trying to make sense of all of this, but there is also another pretty interesting document dedicated to the history of the tower and Juno's plans, again located in Atri, where a local researcher is saying that the Jotnar scholars, that is Juno, Jupiter, and Minerva, were adamant about the first tower being built in the city here called Atri, likely because the positioning of the towers was very important for them to work properly, and thus construction began soon enough, which matches the story told in AC3 by making use of the local workforce here represented as the dwarves. But the most interesting thing here is that as the tower was being built, Juno made several visits to the construction site unbeknownst to Jupiter and Minerva, where she provided the locals with very specific and clear instructions on something, and again this may match the established lore perfectly, as this might have already been where the first method had already been ditched, but some, that is Juno again, came back possibly to give clear instructions to the locals as to how to automate the process and keep building the tower for her own plans. But apparently, while the tower was still unfinished, because the project is still deemed failed in the documents of the DLC, Surtr invaded the territory here called Svartalfheim because he had some plans of his own for the tower, as we just saw. So here we see that Juno, fleeing from Jupiter's and Minerva's wrath, finds out about Surtr's plans to use the failed tower and decides to investigate on it while infiltrating the Atri crater. And it takes her at least 25 days to try and get closer to the tower because of the surveillance there, but still, while she's there, she gets a vision, which again we can interpret as a potential calculation through some artifact of her own, where she finally sees the Surtr tries to twist her shields, that is the towers, into weapons, as we explained earlier. So that's why the tower is so important, but if you need more proof that the tower is the unfinished one from Assassin's Creed 3, look no further. In fact, there is also another document in the game in the A Milna area, which was also sent over to us by Crafting Ranger, where it's directly stated that the Atri tower is Juno's failed project being reworked by Surtr's forces through the production of a lot of silica crystals. And if you need even more, in the Atri entry of the database, the writer, is it still Sean? The writer says that the tower bears all the hallmarks of the Isu tech and asks, could it really be what I think it is? And it is indeed one of the 4 towers built to avert the catastrophe based on Juno's documents. But on that note, that's it for this video where we finally discuss the tower and Surtr's plan in details. What are your opinions about them? Do you think we missed some details or did you get to different conclusions about them? Let us know in the comments below. Also, join us in our next and absolutely final episode of this series where we're going to finally tackle and fully explain the DLC's ending, Juno's full story, the post-credits scene, some calculations potentially concerning Adam, Eve and Baldr, some more references to Assassin's Creed 3, and a full theory as to why Eivor could be going back to Vinland in her final days based on the events shown in the DLC. Thanks for watching and we'll see you in our next video.